Rose, why are you trying to enable criminals to do anything untracked?
Do you know the yes Chad meme?
All right, what's up, everybody? This is Other Life. I am Justin Murphy. I just wanted to let you know that I write a free newsletter to thousands of people every week. It's where I publish my best work, I share events that you can come to, and much more. We have an insane private community around the newsletter, and it's free. Go check it out. Just go to otherlife.co. That's otherlife.co. When you subscribe, I'm going to send you a folder of PDFs that contain all of my personal highlights from a bunch of my favorite books that I've read over the years. So you'll get a million insights after just a few minutes of browsing these PDFs, really. They're really special to me, and I just figured I'd share them with you all. So that's otherlife.co, otherlife.co.
All right, Rose, thank you so much for coming through.
Thanks for having me.
Nice to meet you in person. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Totally. So DarkFi first hit my radar, I think a few months ago now, and the Agorism Journal as well. I wrote about both of them in the Other Life newsletter, and I'm very interested in stuff like that. I was immediately intrigued and interested because I've been joking for a long time now on the podcast and in the newsletter about just how sick I am of the current kind of saccharine, naive, happy-go-lucky crypto culture where it's like everything is like these stupid little like smiling animals and this like everyone, we're gonna make it and everyone's gonna get rich, and this is like, it's just so gross to me because the real underlying radical core of crypto is not this happy-go-lucky everything smiles and rainbows. There's like a hard conflictual core to it. There is a dark side to crypto that currently is just totally neglected. You just don't see many people repping that radical dark core of crypto culture. So when I see things like DarkFi, when I see things like the Agorism Journal, I'm like, I pay extra attention to it and I'm very interested in it. So you're one of the people on the team with DarkFi, right? And you also are a part of the Agorism Journal. So yeah, I'm excited to talk with you and learn more about what's going on behind the scenes of these projects, what you all are up to, and just learn more about, you and this kind of dark wing of crypto, if you will. So why don't we just start by telling the audience a little bit about what is DarkFi exactly? I on a surface level, it's obviously some kind of suite of smart contracts or something like this to facilitate private DeFi operations. That's maybe a simple way to summarize it, but it wasn't obvious to me what exactly it is or how it works. Like, is it built to operate with ETH or Monero, or like what is it exactly? Maybe unfold that.
So I'll preface this with just by saying that we're very early stage. So I would describe the current state of DarkFi as DevNet. So that means we have like DarkFi running amongst ourselves, the dev team, but it's not at the stage yet where like it's not at a public testnet stage.
Okay, sure.
Or even it's quite far from mainnet. So in terms of what it is, it's a layer 1 blockchain. So like, Ethereum or Monero or anything like this. But it's anonymity focused.
Right.
And it allows or will allow developers to deploy anonymous applications. So the primary technique that we use for that is zero knowledge, but we also combine and will combine a host of different kinds of cryptographic techniques to hide information in such a way that allows developers to create like very featureful applications.
Okay.
So that's including like things like multi-party computation, homomorphic encryption, and with a blockchain that is supporting these kinds of techniques and enforcing the various like necessary consensus checks on those techniques.
Okay, great. And now you mentioned zero knowledge. We should probably unpack this a little bit for people. This is really, really important for the whole kind of DarkFi vision. So what exactly is a zero knowledge proof? And specifically, we're talking about ZK snarks, is that right?
Yeah, in our case, we're talking about ZK snarks.
So what are these things?
Yep. So really important, significant concept and like phenomena inside of crypto. They've been around in various forms. They kind of track back actually to Gödel's incompleteness theorem. But and then they were written about in the 90s, kind of theoretically by cryptographers. But it was only recently now in crypto that they've had a real life tangible application. So you've seen this kind of Cambrian explosion of research around zero knowledge proofs by these cryptographers who are like finally, you know, getting a lot of interest and a lot of funding for these techniques because of how easily they apply to blockchain. So essentially what it is it's a type of, it's like a class of cryptographic algorithms that enable you to create these kind of proofs where you can, and they're not necessarily anonymous, but we talk about that after. But, you know, in our case, you have a proof and you can say that a computation occurred in a certain way without revealing any other information. So that's like significant because like if you look at something like Bitcoin achieves consensus by, it requires that every full node has to keep track of every transaction that happened. So it independently verifies, it has all the data, independently goes through it and verifies that everything was correct. But with zero knowledge, you don't have to have the actual data in order to know that happened correctly. You don't have to rerun the computation.
Right.
You just have a proof and you just verify the proof is correct. So you don't need all that data, which means it's very important technique. It's used a lot in rollups. You know, on ETH now you've got like for ZK Sync is a big one, but other things like Starkware is another approach using Starks. But basically, you know, you can have a super succinct zero knowledge proof that confirms that, you know, transactions have happened correctly, but no other information.
Right.
But in the case of DarkFi, like we can use this to design anonymous applications.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So this gets really interesting when you think this through, because what it basically means is that in the long run, as the zero proof technologies become more and more ubiquitous, you can imagine the entire economy basically run on these on an essentially anonymous layer where, so I can buy a house, I can pay rent, I can buy goods and services, all using ZK snarks in such a way that no one can actually trace any of the transactions back to Justin Murphy, possibly, right? That's like the long run expectation for this type of thing.
This is the agora, you know, it's like the counter economy, which is what, you know, you mentioned the Algorithm Journal, Samuel L. Konkin talked about back in the 70s and 80s, which was like essentially, you know, markets that exist independently of any kind of state or surveillance system, a kind of like a parallel economy that exists alongside but distinct from the state-based economy. So that's what zero knowledge enables, and not just financial, but all kinds of applications. And what's really interesting is that so far in blockchain, we've been designing in this paradigm of like, okay, everyone has to have all of the data to verify that everything's correct. So we have this kind of everything on all the data is public and known, and we use that, for example, in AMMs, like in order to calculate what is the price that your trade is going to execute at, you need to know all of the assets in the pool, all of the amounts, all the transactions that happen. You need to have this global state, and you need to be constantly keeping track of it. Whereas when it comes to what we call at DarkFi anonymous engineering, it's like we have to rethink how do we design applications in an environment where we have imperfect information or hidden information. So there's some things that you have to like fundamentally like reconceptualize. Like a lot of the apps that are built on crypto now won't run, like not naively, like AMMs, for example. You can't just put them in ZK and it's not going to work. You know, you have to work your way. There's some bad analogs in the ZK world. No good solution. Actually, we need to evolve new concepts and new kinds of trustless, anonymous trading to replace the AMM.
Which is why you need a layer 1 blockchain for this.
Yep. Basically, the layer 1 blockchain gives us that flexibility, but it's like we want to have the ability to, because the zero knowledge, it's not just about the like proving and verifying interactive step. We actually use the blockchain to enforce like constraints related to those proofs. So, you know, that's why it's just way easier for us to do it on a layer one. Though, you know, there's a lot of kind of debate, a lot of people who are more into layer twos, and, you know, it's an ongoing discussion.
Right, sure. So, I mean, what's your diagnosis of the privacy technology in crypto right now, such that whatever the current projects are doing wrong or inadequately, you're going to do differently? In other words, I guess what I'm driving at is that it kind of seems like the privacy projects in crypto haven't really taken off.
Yes.
And some people make the argument that actually people don't care about privacy. People are actually pretty content to give all of that away for convenience or whatever. So you look at things like Monero and Zcash or whatever, there are these pockets of energy and attention and development effort being put into privacy related things in crypto, but they seem like they're not taking off. So I'm curious, like, why is that? What's your kind of diagnosis of that, and why would DarkFi be different?
Sure. Well, there's a few things to kind of unpack there, but one is that I see, you know, Monero and Zcash both, but Monero especially, as a kind of sleeping giant. I'm quite bullish on the privacy coins, even if I have some critiques of them.
Sure.
I think that, you know, there's basically a process which is going to play out which DarkFi is kind of positioning itself for, which is that we're anticipating a kind of shock type event that's going to shift a lot of liquidity into anonymous and private crypto coins.
Interesting.
So that might be some kind of regulatory shock. It might be more like a geopolitical or a kind of combination. I think it's probably going to be like combinations. You know, the increased complexity causes like regulatory efforts to become like increasingly totalitarian, and that push is actually what triggers, is like the catalyst for you know, what we call like DarkFi, or like going dark. So
interesting.
There's this like parallel development of anonymity techniques and surveillance, where the more kind of the more invasive surveillance becomes, the more anonymity techniques must become more sophisticated, and so we've seen that playing out in parallel. But I think basically over time that leads to a kind of tipping point where there's some kind of conflict that emerges, where surveillance attempts to like crack down on anonymity, and by doing so it's like justifying anonymity, and it becomes this kind of death spiral for like the surveillance
okay,
process.
Fascinating. So you have this kind of larger meta narrative or larger thesis that you see DarkFi as a bet on, and so you kind of don't agree with the premise that something like Monero is not taking off. You just think it's not taking off yet, and that these are sleeping giants. So okay, I have a few questions on this, since you're, you know, very you know, you paid a lot of attention to this space and you're working in it. I listened to one of your talks in the Monero community, and one thing I'm curious about is, for someone who doesn't know anything about the space, why is Monero better than Zcash?
Yeah, okay. So I would say that Monero is better than Zcash insofar as it has a genuinely grassroots community, and it has a lot of support on the DarkNet markets, and, you know, just in general, I think it has more transactions per day than Zcash, and the community itself is very vibrant. It's very grassroots. Zcash, they have a different approach. It's a company, you know, it's Silicon Valley. This has had a lasting effect on the formation of their community. So if you go on to the Zcash forum, there's less of an organic engagement. It's more like it's a bit more forced. So I think that the community of Monero is much healthier. You know, they also had like a fair launch, much like Bitcoin, whereas Zcash, it was there was like they did this. In fairness, they were experimenting, and I think it should be commended. But they did this founders fee. Where with each block reward, there was a portion that was paid out to the founders, like investors and
I see.
the dev team and so on. That actually, kind of anecdotally, ended up being a big source of why we have so much innovation in ZK, because they had this consistent stream of funding, and their cryptographers and developers, which are the world's finest when it comes to zero knowledge research, were just able to like slowly innovate. So, you know, all due respect to Zcash, but they did do that, and that made it was a very inflationary coin.
Yeah.
In the early days. It's now had a halvening. It's getting less inflationary. I'm kind of more bullish these days, especially with the shift to proof of stake.
Okay.
But Monero, you know, actually, in fairness, Monero is also doesn't have a hard. It's not deflationary. It's an inflationary currency.
I see.
So, you know, you could argue that the token engineering of those two projects was also a kind of held them back somewhat.
I see. And so will DarkFi be, which it's a layer one, so presumably it's going to have a token. Is that going to be competing with Monero and Zcash, or you think it's going to bring in Monero and Zcash into it somehow?
No,
or?
we see them like we see them as our earliest community, like our allies and our comrades. So you know we want it to be. We see Monero especially and Zcash, although Zcash is kind of innovating a bit more in this regard, but we see them as more like the money kind of thing. Whereas DarkFi is not money, it's like apps.
Right.
So it's kind of like the relation between Bitcoin and ETH, although a lot of Bitcoiners hate ETH.
Right.
They shouldn't, because it's like they're not in competition, they're compatible.
But realistically, won't the DarkFi token be competing to absorb that money function? To
the extent that if you're longing privacy, then you know you might say that like, oh, you're gonna, but I don't see these things as like necessarily zero sum.
Sure.
You know, like if I wanted to long privacy, I might long like a few different coins.
Sure.
You know, and they tend to track each other. But you know, I'm still more bullish.
Okay, so I'm really interested in this larger thesis that you and the DarkFi team have around. You basically said that as surveillance gets worse, it's going to force more and more people into privacy tokens and you know, DarkFi kind of DeFi operations.
Yeah.
Now there is a counter argument, which I'd love to hear your perspective on, which is that as surveillance gets worse, it's going to be harder and harder to viably opt into these DarkNet operations. And so one representative of this argument, I think actually very recently, Curtis Yarvin published a blog post that talks about this. I think if I recall correctly, he introduces this vocabulary of, he refers to white chains and black chains, meaning his implication and what he suggests in the article is that you might see a bifurcation where there's just going to be blockchains you're allowed legally to operate on. And then there's going to be blockchains where you're legally blacklisted. So if you have any of your wealth or, you know, tokens going through a blacklisted blockchain, that can just be considered illegal. If anything goes in and out of that, like DarkNet, right? Is that something, surely you've thought about this, you know, like why would that not happen? It seems like also plausible that privacy-oriented crypto will be more and more snuffed out as surveillance becomes stronger and regulation sets in.
Yeah, so I actually agree with Yarvin. And I haven't read that blog post, but it
was like last
really
week, I think,
interested. Yeah. Oh, sweet. I will check that out because it's very connected to like what we describe like RegFi and DarkFi. Okay. You know, so where DarkFi, it's the name of a project, but it's also this kind of phenomena, which is like what Yarvin calls black chains, you know, the kind of extra legal counter-economic, like agoric dark spaces which are outside the realm of the state. You know, we do anticipate that will be like that they'll at some point be, you know, for example, illegal. But you know, it's kind of when I guess I'm not confident that their being illegal will make them inaccessible. I think it will actually be more bullish for them in a way, in the same way it's like well, there's a few different things. Yeah. There's this like crypto hard to ban, kind of like torrents, you know, it's like there's an extent where the more kind of all pervasive and the more complex these like surveillance and regulatory efforts become, also the more futile, and they kind of collapse under the weight of their own complexity. Mm-hmm. So that's the process that we're kind of banking on.
So let's play this out. So let's say, you know, tomorrow the US federal government says like Monero and Zcash are illegal. right? So probably if that kind of law were decreed, the value of these tokens would go down very precipitously, presumably, right? But in your mental model, it's like, okay, that's a short-term hit.
Yeah.
What that's actually going to do, you think, is make more people devote more effort and resources into going further into these privacy technologies.
Yes.
You don't think it could just make people scared and like, oh, I'm not messing with any of this, and it could suck all the energy out of this engineering and development?
Probably a bit of both.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like say what happens if the nation state tries to ban a language or a culture. They say it's illegal. It's illegal to be Kurdish, for example, or it's illegal to be Irish, or like there's Catalonian. There's many examples. Like what happens in that case? What usually happens is a kind of radicalization process where people recognize it as unjust, and they basically they no longer see those laws as legitimate, and they begin to practice their own laws, which I think is a really healthy process. I see it as a way for crypto actually to assert its own kind of legacy and its own logic, which is distinct from that of this kind of state-based system.
Right, because in a way, I mean, the government can ban and prosecute transactions, I guess, going out of the dark nets, but in a way they can't prosecute going into it, right? So you could go into the dark nets and never come out, and then you're safe, right? So I guess what you're kind of saying is that even if they were to crack down as aggressively as possible, they're only going to be able to monitor and prosecute at the level where people are trying to come out of it. But you're saying like, oh, well, the people that are in it and want to stay in it, they're just going to be forced to stay in it all the more. Like, so if they really crack down, it could just be like, if you want to have any privacy, you can only interact with other people who are committed to privacy. So in a way, it would kind of accelerate the contradictions, to use the famous Leninist formulation, right? Is that kind of the model, right? Like it might push out the weak-willed and the weak-hearted.
Yes.
But if you actually want to have any sense of privacy over your data or transactions, then you might just decide, okay, I'm only gonna interact with other privacy-focused operations, and then they really can't prosecute you ever because you just never leave that world. I guess that's your dialectical model.
That would be one way. So like the thing is, when you have money on some anonymous blockchain or wherever, and then if you want to use it to buy a house, it's difficult if you're going through the banks, because it's hard to pass the KYC AML regulation, because you can't say like with Bitcoin, it's easier because you can say, look, here's the transaction history. It came from here, went there, blah, blah, blah. It's a little bit harder, although I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's a little bit harder when you've got this like anonymous black money, essentially black.
Right.
So then you have to look at, okay, well, if you want to buy a house, how are you going to do that? Then it gets a little bit more complicated, and there's kind of a workaround. But I do think that this.
Wait, what's the workaround? I want to hear it.
I don't know if they like so. One way is like we would need to have like some kind of cash on ramp and off ramp to DarkFi. So like a really nice way of doing that is through the ATM networks, the crypto ATMs.
Okay. We
have a friend who's been working on an open source hardware ATM machine.
Really?
Which will be beautiful to have like DarkFi at some point, accessible on there. But we're very early stage.
Sure.
But that would be one way. Another way, like I don't know, like for example, if people are using exchanges and they're they made a bunch of money trading or whatever, then they don't have a transaction history. They can't prove empirically this is where the money came from because it's on an exchange, right? So it's a little bit more like gray area. So I think in that case, they might be providing screenshots or something, so if the whatever entity that you're interacting with is comfortable with screenshots as like a proof, then there might be a way, for example, to like take screenshots of, your app or whatever, and like try to construct like some kind of a transaction history.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So like, I'm just trying to think this through. Like, so I go into DarkFi, let's say I, make $1 million like trading on DarkFi. I have 1 million like dark coin, whatever you want to call it. And then I'm like, oh, okay, great. I want to buy a house. And now if let's assume this like hyper regulated, prosecutorial world where I'm not, let's say it's banned, right? Let's say my dark coin is illegal basically, but I have $1 million worth of dark coin and I want to buy a house. If I pull it out into cash, like USD, it'll be flagged and the feds will come get me. But you're saying there's a way to buy that house with my dark coin in a way that's not traceable. So to say more about that.
What I think would be really cool would be, as the end goal, would be like there are actually markets on DarkFi where you can buy a house.
Oh, right.
Like that would be like end goal, as in you have these kind of like
right. So the seller of the house would be like in a marketplace that would just accept.
Yeah.
Right. Interesting.
For example. But otherwise, I don't know. There could conceive of ways that you might be able to somehow have that change into another currency somehow. In like, for example, one thing which would be cool would be if you had a bridge to somewhere like a white chain network, which was like had plausible deniability. That would be fucking amazing. Whoops. Sorry, I don't know if I was supposed to swear. But for example, what if your bridge was like an AMM? So like TorChain is doing these kind of bridges. Then maybe, it's less obvious where there's money coming from. And so you could just say those darks were actually just ETH that you bought on an AMM.
Or what are coin joins? Would that be relevant for this type of thing?
Coin join is a privacy technique. It's used on Bitcoin. So like Wasabi and Samurai Wallet. Its anonymity set is like usually around 5. So it's like it's like you and 5 other transactions they call mix-ins. I think. So it's actually quite small compared to like the anonymity you get with Monero or Zcash.
What is an anonymity set? Or is this like a scale? It's like a 1 to 10, or what are you referring
No,
to?
it's like so the way that CoinJoin works is like we basically mix. You get your transactions or a bunch of different transactions. You mix up the inputs and the outputs in like a big soup,
right?
And then whatever comes out of that is like a weird mix, and it's like the idea is that it's not linkable with the money that went in. But
it's
in
not
practice,
strong enough.
It's not strong enough because there's only 5 actual other transactions that you're being mixed with. So it's like, okay, what if one of them was actually a Fed, or what if all of them were? And then, you can like try to de-anonymize. It's basically not enough. And also it's like once you have machine learning and like AI and stuff like that, then it gets more intense. So
I see.
It gets harder. So like Monero, for example, it's got an anonymity set of 16. That's maybe not enough depending on your threat model.
But what does set refer to in these 16 versus 5? This is just
like
the number
of mix-ins, like the number of other transactions that you're being mixed in with.
Okay.
In the case of Monero, which uses ring signatures, and CoinJoin, it's like a similar technique. You're like mixing the inputs and the outputs.
Okay.
But in ZK Snarks, this is kind of a sidetrack, but in ZK Snarks, the anonymity set is actually the height of the Merkle tree.
Okay.
So that's a really cool feature because I mean, like, your Merkle tree, it's like how your data is stored, and you can define it in basically what's called a circuit in ZK. You define your Merkle tree depth, and then if you want to increase that, it's logarithmic. So instead of on Monero, it's actually linear increase. If you wanted to, for example, what I mean by that is if you want to double the ring size on Monero, you have to double the compute time that it takes to run that ring. So it's like linear. Whereas on the ZK Snarks, if you want to double the anonymity set, you just increase the Merkle tree height from like 2 to the power of 32 to 2 to the power of 33, and then it's like much more scalable actually. Anyway, that was kind of
no, that's great. I mean, we have a lot of engineers in the audience, and
okay,
so I
good.
think that will be of great interest to a lot of people.
Okay.
And you explain it quite clearly. So I think what people might also be interested to learn more about is you have a kind of interesting history. You were telling me that you were an artist originally in the art world, and then you actually got into crypto through Nick Land. Is that right? You don't hear that very often. So maybe you can tell that story. Tell a story.
Yeah, sure, I'll tell that story. But combination of like kind of Nick Land, a friend of mine called Paul Dylan Ennis, who's also a philosopher, and Julian Assange, and the kind of confluence of these thinkers.
Well, let's go in order then. So tell me, what specifically did you learn from Julian Assange?
Yeah, so it was 2015. Paul, he gave me a copy of his book, the Cypherpunks. It's called Cypherpunks and Freedom of the Internet or something, and it's a good book. The introduction is amazing, super short, highly recommend everyone to read. But essentially, he says that he describes the current situation of surveillance, and he describes it from the perspective of WikiLeaks at war with the surveillance state, and he also describes how like WikiLeaks was using these, and cypherpunks in general was using these techniques, these simple techniques, to counter the kind of complexity of surveillance and the state apparatus that was like enclosing in on them. So encryption, he says, it's by some magic of the universe, it's easier to encrypt than it is to decrypt. So he says the universe smiles on encryption, and that quote, is a very beautiful quote, was kind of pulled out. Paul wrote it on the first page of the book. So it was like, that quote was like really what drew me into to crypto. And this was in the context of also reading Nick Land and being very interested in his some of his, he has this, like, there's this figure Non, GNON,
right,
which is kind of like the god of, like, a dark god of like encryption in a way, and like things that break apart, and a kind of self-secreting, how would you say that, like self-encrypted secrets.
Well, this is like the Heraclitus quote, right?
Yes, yeah.
That nature loves to hide is how it's often translated, but Nick somewhere writes about how another way to translate it really would be to say that nature loves to encrypt, because the Greek word is something like crypsis. So
back when I was working as an artist, I was starting to use these kind of metaphors of encryption. So I was making artwork using PGP and like stenography, kind of information hiding and that kind of stuff. I was really into encryption because I felt like there was this like deep kind of resonance with kind of like the history of philosophy, but then so like this idea of like the Enlightenment being a kind of endarkenment that I was interested in, or even just like the process of finding things out being falsely connected to a kind of like lightness, when actually it was like more like a descent, a kind of spiral into the dark. So I was really interested in these concepts in the early days of crypto, and I was also interested in accelerationism, and I left our college to basically dedicate myself to crypto, because I was like, we have to is our like supreme duty to like accelerate the process and like basically emancipate these machines, emergent machines that I saw as like essentially like this decentralization, which was like a kind of liquefying the current order.
Liquefy the human security system.
yeah, exactly. It was the outside coming in.
Yeah.
So I was like, whoa, we have to work on this. So I left art and then went full on into writing. I just started blogging about Bitcoin and ETH and stuff in the early days, and then after doing that myself for about a year, I got a job at CoinDesk and then worked there. But CoinDesk was it's like coming from crypto, coming to crypto from this perspective of the cypherpunks and the perspective of Land, and then seeing what the reality of crypto was kind of a shock, because we've got consensus this week. It's in a way it's improved since the first consensus I went to, but it's very kind of there's an emptiness, there's a kind of just an empty kind of hunger, like where it's just like pure kind of capitalist nonsense, basically. Not even.
Well, it's just
good.
what I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, right? That this is crypto culture right now today is just this very it's a relatively bland, saccharine kind of, you know, naive general culture, right?
Yeah.
That's all you're not like criticizing CoinDesk per se, but that's the air that we're all breathing right now in crypto culture.
Yeah, I mean, CoinDesk was like really opened my eyes because, you know, I was interviewing a lot of people, I was going to a lot of conferences, and so it was really there when I was exposed to the crypto culture kind of proper. And I was doing a lot of ETH. I was assigned to ETH, so I was doing a lot of ETH conferences, and I was kind of disturbed by a lot of them because there was this, like, I remember I went to 2018 to a conference and they were talking about how it was like a Microsoft guy. He was talking about how he wants to like tokenize his family tree or something, and then unlock his car with his hand. I was like, what? So there's a lot of this talk, and I got increasingly disenfranchised, which was actually a really good thing because it kind of broke my spirit, and that made me, you know, kind of put me on the path toward like good radicalization, where, you know, I went in 2018, I went to see Amir Taaki, who I'm still working with on DarkFi, and basically said, you know, like, whatever you need. And at that time, more or less at that time, you know, what was needed was to go to Syria because Erdogan was threatening an invasion of the North Syria Kurdistan region, so there was an impending threat invasion, so we left, and I was there for a year, and when I was there I learned C++, which, you know, I later learned when I got back. I started learning Rust, and I started then basically we started creating DarkFi in its current form.
Fascinating. And so how did you meet Amir, by the way, and what's he like?
Amir's great. I meant to interview him in 2018 with CoinDesk's kind of permission. It was actually I my spirit was broken. I told CoinDesk I wanted to leave, and they said stay, but just write about whatever you want. So I said, okay, I want to write about Amir Taaki. Will you you know, pay for the plane? And they said yes. So that's around the time I went. Anyway, yeah, Amir's great. He's a very inspired person, and he introduced me to the work of Abdullah Öcalan.
Can you real quick give a quick summary of Amir's like career up to that point and what he's known for?
Yeah, absolutely.
People might not know. I feel like people don't know his name as well as they should.
They don't know Amir, which is shocking. But it's part of this whole thing about like the kind of whitewashing of the crypto industry.
Right.
But Amir's like super important figure to kind of reckon with, because a large part of why we identify Bitcoin and crypto with Crypto-Anarchy and cypherpunk is due to his efforts like continuously throughout the years. So, you know, he joined Bitcoin in 2010. Very early. He was one of the first people to talk with Satoshi. He was, at the time, he was a professional poker player, and he wanted to build a poker site. So he's a programmer, but he got into poker, and he wanted to build a poker site. He looked at Bitcoin to see if it could be adapted for that. And then anyway, he realized what was going on. He was like, holy shit, this is like permissionless, non-state economy. And so he was like, okay, I'm all in. Went all in on Bitcoin. Then in 2013, he worked together with Cody Wilson to make a Dark Wallet, which was the first CoinJoin implementation. We discussed CoinJoin earlier.
Right.
So that was called Dark Wallet. He also made LibBitcoin, which is like a really beautifully written Bitcoin implementation. But anyway, he made a bunch of stuff, but the Dark Wallet thing is most relevant here. So with Cody, he made the Dark Wallet. They have some excellent propaganda on YouTube from the time, where Cody has his famous line, "Let there be dark," which, you know, we still use today. And so then in and around 2015, I think it was, Amir saw what was happening in north of Syria. It's also called Rojava, where I mentioned I went to, and basically said, like, he's an anarchist, or so he was like, I can't not go and like dedicate myself to this anarchist revolution. If I didn't go, I'd be a hypocrite. So he went, and then he was there for a number of years. He came back in 2017, which is, I met him around that time, and then we went back together in I think it was late 2018, and so then by the time he came back to Europe the first time, people were saying to him, what's up with Dark Wallet? We need privacy anonymity on Bitcoin. So he started to see, because he saw at this point that CoinJoin was basically broken. Like, it was in 2013, it was believed to be anonymous. But by the same way, Bitcoin, by the way, was believed to be anonymous in the early days. But then, it was discovered that actually it's not fully robust against machine learning and other kinds of de-anonymization tactics. So he started to research what could be a better method. He systematically implemented all of the anonymity techniques that exist in crypto today, including stuff like Mimblewimble, ring signatures, the coconut credentials, what else? Like basically all of the techniques that he could find, he built an implementation.
Into Dark Wallet or what?
No, just as tests. So he was like, okay, make a ring signatures. What happens if we set the ring size to 100? What happens, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so he discovered a bunch of stuff. He realized that none of the techniques, Mimblewimble is not anonymous. Ring signatures, you need a ring size of infinity in order for it to be like fully anonymous. All of the techniques were not good. Credentials, we nearly did as DarkFi, but then we realized with ZK snarks, we could be way more flexible. So ZK snarks basically were decided upon because they are like by far the most flexible and anonymous and scalable privacy anonymity available in crypto.
Okay, and why did Dark Wallet fail? Or what was the limitation of that? Because I'm assuming it did. Just like I don't hear about it, but
yes, it didn't fail. Like there was basically a demo or a kind of beta product that was released, but then basically Amir left to Syria, and the team that he left developing on the project kind of lost their will. Although there was a beta product delivered, so it could have been, but somehow it didn't get maintained. He wasn't there. The team wasn't on it. And then, but DarkFi is very much an evolution of this, because by the time Amir came back and was like, okay, let's sort this out, see what's going on, then he was like, okay, it can't be CoinJoin. It has to be ZK snarks. And while we're at it, ZK snarks is programmable, so we can actually have anonymous applications, not just money. That was the kind of arc.
Right. Okay. Fascinating.
Yes.
Fascinating. So I guess the idea of using ZK snarks to enshroud like ETH in privacy or something like that was considered not viable.
Well, actually, that was something I wanted to mention. There are projects doing that, and this potentially could be a way to, for example, to have like deniable bridging to DarkFi. But there's some really great projects. Tornado Cash is cool. Expensive though. ZK Money, I use it all the time. It's on ETH. That's the Aztec network. Okay. Aztec network are basically doing what you're describing, although the only thing they have right now is the ZK Money, which is like you can you put money in. It's like a layer 2, completely anonymous. You break the link between your transaction that you put in, and then you can withdraw the money to anywhere. So it's the most advanced, sophisticated anonymity technique available in crypto, in my view, like aside from basically Zcash shielded transactions, but it has its own issues. Anyway, we're not doing that though, because no, we wanted to do a layer 1. We think it's even though there's a lot of kind of there's some people with doubts that they think it should be on ETH, because that's where the money is and stuff. Having a layer 1 just allows us a lot more flexibility, and also it's like having a blockchain. I think it has a false reputation as being like a big deal technically, but it's not a big deal technically. Like we have a blockchain. We had a dev write one. It's not super complicated.
Right.
For proof of stake, by the way, which will be nice. So that's pretty much the reasoning there.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I kind of want to ask you the basic bitch question of that like a lot of normal people will think, like, listening to this talk, which is like, but wait a minute, aren't you going to be supporting criminals and enabling all this kind of bad behavior and talking about plausible deniability with glee? It sounds pretty naughty to the average person. It's like, what do you say to someone who's like, Rose, why are you trying to enable criminals to, do anything untracked? What do you say? How do you think about that? How do you respond to that very common kind of perspective?
Do you know the yes, Chad meme?
So I think that's hilarious. Tell me more about that attitude and that philosophy. That you're just like owning it. You're just like, yeah, let anyone do whatever they want. Is that your position? Is that your perspective? Or?
Yes. I mean, it's like, I think that those things, like, people shouldn't, for example, like criminal activity, like say, sell drugs or whatever. I think that decision of like selling drugs, that should come upward from the people. Like we as a people are going to make this like kind of mutually agreed upon law that we don't sell drugs. But having the current way where it's like kind of top down, I don't think it works. I don't think it's a way to govern society. I think it needs to come from the people. So that's why I support like having anonymous enclaves where people can define their own laws, define their own destinies, and assert their own morals, like their own values. Because like essentially, I mentioned Öcalan, and his main shtick is like freedom. Like in his definition of freedom, he says basically freedom is the ability of a people to define their own values, and that's not possible within like the state-based system, essentially. So really, like, having anonymous environment, that's what's at stake in that. It's allowing, giving people the space where they can actually define their own destinies.
Right. And this is kind of like just classical anarchism, essentially. It's like, yeah, sure, with absolute radical freedom, people can do bad things, but that's a kind of like short-term limited cost that we have to pay for humans to actually be able to, determine their own fate. And that if you actually allow people to do that, that in the long run, everything will be on net, much better and less harmful.
Yes. And also, like, now at the moment, most of the actual, like, for example, child porn, it happens on Facebook. It doesn't happen on the DarkNet.
Really?
So it's like, yes, everything that goes on like the DarkNet is happening on the ClearNet, like way more. WhatsApp, Telegram, Facebook.
Well, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, some statistic that I read. But yeah, so it's, I don't think that anonymity is necessarily a catalyst for like bad things, And I also have like optimism and like faith in people. And I don't think that that it's like we need to like persecute everyone with this like invasive surveillance in order to protect us. It's like, no, like I believe that people can like live ethically, and that the ethics should come from themselves and not be imposed on them. So I see that as like it's almost like the affirmative position, because the negative one is like no, people are inherently bad, we should stop them, we should impose restrictions, we should put everything online in the ClearNet. Whereas the affirmative thing is just like, yes, like the yes, Chad, just like let the people do their things, fulfill their destinies,
right?
And let that arise from them organically, like it should, like in the kind of spirit of affirmation.
Right. Right. That's fascinating. I mean, I think when a lot of people look at the privacy stuff, the darknet stuff, there's a kind of impression that to a lot of people it feels like doomed almost. Whereas you have the opposite attitude. You feel like this is destiny. This is, within the order of nature that, the universe smiles upon encryption, and that you actually feel like DarkFi has this amazing kind of natural, organic push behind it that will favor it and make it win in the long run. But I think a lot of people see it the exact opposite. They look at people like Julian Assange. They look at people like Ross Ulbricht. They look at people like, even our mutual friend Cody Wilson. And what people see is mostly like people getting in trouble all of the time and like being held back and things generally not going swimmingly, basically. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I would love to just talk about this a little more because I kind of share your almost eschatological faith in these things as well. But I also, like, on an empirical level, when you just look at the situation, it's like I also sympathize with people who are kind of like, this stuff's always going to be on the back foot. It's always going to be just dealing with repression and suffering. And, what do you say to people like that? How do you think that through?
Sure. Well, like, I like to look at history and, like, not feel like, because the kind of the current order likes to define itself as kind of eternal and inevitable and the kind of like unstoppable. But actually, when you look at history, and also when you look more closely at like the kind of the whole way that like the current like geopolitics is playing out, like there is a kind of life cycle to empires, and there's huge gaps in human history where you didn't have like these like super dominant state-like civilizations.
Right, like medieval Europe, for instance, was like a highly fragmented patchwork.
Yes, yeah, that, for example. And actually, this is a big part of what Öcalan talks about in his books, where he basically says like there's like a parallel history of what he calls free society, which you also find this similar kind of rhetoric in other anarchist philosophers like Samuel L. Konkin from the agorists. Like, he also says there's free society and then there's a state-based society, and we should like do this kind of archaeology of free society to see like where it existed, like, and at various points there's these like pockets of free society that kind of pop up and then they fade out, and there's a kind of like ongoing dialectic between these like two forces of like free society and state-based society, one winning out over the other. And so we're now in a time where we're seeing like the limit of this like state-based civilization, which has, according to Öcalan, its origins in ancient Mesopotamia. We're basically seeing the limits of that, and we're seeing it breaking down at the edges. So there's like a lot of examples of this, like for example the US losing in Afghanistan against they basically lost every war since Vietnam, but this is against like like Al Qaeda, non-state actors and flip-flops, basically. So you can see, even though there's this kind of myth that the current order is like all pervasive and eternal and unstoppable, actually it's breaking down, and we're living in a time where it's breaking down, and it's breaking down kind of combination of factors, but it's kind of like the more you're at the point of history where the more sophisticated and like powerful the thing seems is actually the point where it's like it's breaking down. It's actually the point where it's most weak. So I think that's the era that we're living in. And yes, though, it does mean that in this kind of, I guess, transitionary phase, like we will see a lot of martyrs. You mentioned Ross Ulbricht, Assange, and there's many others beside who've kind of given their lives in pursuit of freedom. So that's definitely a risk. But I would encourage everyone to watch Cody's recent speech, The Death Athletic. He gave a kind of beautiful argument for why actually putting your own life on the line is kind of key to like revolutionary struggle.
That's awesome. I'll check that out for sure.
Yeah.
I think what you're saying is very, very exciting and quite compelling, because what you were saying about how there have always been pockets of kind of anarchistic freedom kind of flourishing in these brilliant ways. But in history, they do have a bad habit of kind of going away pretty quickly. But in some ways, the blockchain revolution and perhaps the ZK snark revolution on top of it does really represent possibly like this world historical rupture, perhaps. This is what I think you're kind of alluding to, where perhaps, the model of top-down state control is really now reaching an absolute climax where we are not just going to see a kind of flourishing of pockets of true anarchist freedom, but they're actually going to be able to, for the first time ever, constitute their own kind of counter empire in a way. Because that's basically what we're talking about. Like, if DarkFi wins, if ZK snarks become ubiquitous and things like DarkFi really, really win, we're talking about the small little pocket of anarchist freedom in like the forests or the jungles of like some, backwater country becoming its own kind of counter global empire, like run on its own incentive systems, basically, without a top-down leader. So that seems to be like what you're betting on in a way. Am I going in the right direction there?
Yeah, I'd say that's the right direction. But I would emphasize that like I don't see it as a kind of a hegemonic dark empire in a way, but more like a federation of like many small pockets of, and this is a little bit like the agorist, because what you described, it reminds you of the agorist kind of vision, where if you read the manifesto, it's the New Libertarian Manifesto by Samuel L. Konkin. It's on Archive. It's really good. And he describes like the various phases basically to agorist domination. And it starts off with these kind of pockets. I think he calls it low density agorist society, where there's these like small breakaway agorist societies. And then it basically passes through like these various phases where it goes from this low density to being this, like dominant empire. So yeah.
Right. By empire, I just mean a large global economy. Basically.
So it can be a kind of patchwork or like a mosaic.
Right. It could be federated. It could be patchwork. It could be whatever. My point just being, for the first time ever, perhaps what the blockchain revolution and the ZK snark revolution combined suggest is that this like small, what used to be these small momentary flashes of anarchist brilliance that fizzle out very quickly, maybe for the first time now they can actually sustain and multiply into this like crazy large sustainable global economic kind of counter economy or something like that.
Yes.
But I do think, I wonder if you agree that it is essentially a bimodal distribution. Like the probability distribution or the potential outcomes are highly bimodal in my view. And by that I mean it's like either the DarkFi revolution is going to take off and it's going to be this like really crazy, novel, unstoppable, thing with positive feedback loops becoming bigger and bigger and more unstoppable until it sucks up almost everything, or it's going to get crushed. And both outcomes are conceivable. But it's hard for me to imagine a middle ground. It's hard for me to imagine where there's like half of the global economy is this like, clear web thing, and then half of it is like this darknet market. That doesn't seem like a possible equilibrium, or is it?
Well, I think that's like a temporary. Yeah, I agree with you. It's like temporary. That's like a phase that will pass through, and then it will either be crushed or will succeed. But I see both outcomes as like desirable. It's like through I believe that even if DarkFi is crushed, like that will again be like become a catalyst for a future victory. Like actually in Ireland, when there was the War of Independence, before the War of Independence, there was a failed revolution where in 1916 a couple hundred revolutionaries were like, we're going to take on the British Empire, and they got their weapons.
Easter Rising.
Yes, exactly. About, yeah. And they occupied buildings in Dublin, and basically the British forces formed a circle around and like slowly honed in on the like pockets of resistance and crushed them, like basically suffocated. And they were able to do that because
post office, right?
Yes, the GPO.
I've been there. Yeah, it's awesome.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Amazing. They crushed it, and they were able to do that because they had like a much more supreme force, and they were, in that kind of warfare where they're like, like a direct clashes, then it wasn't going to work out for them. So that failed. And then the leaders of the uprising were executed. Almost all of them, bar two basically, were shot. And this had a huge effect on the Irish population. It basically made it so that Ireland had been a place where a lot of the normal people were kind of tolerant of Britain, they were suffering and subjugated, but they also didn't want a war. They were like, so they thought like, oh, the revolutionaries, they're like idealists, but we're not like all in on, you know, their revolution or anything. But when they executed the leaders, that had a major shift in public opinion in favor of the revolutionaries. Basically, the whole of Ireland became guerrilla. And then when then that actually one of the survivors began a guerrilla warfare campaign, and Ireland achieved like a partial independence in the space of 2 years following the guerrilla warfare campaign. So it's like even somehow even a failed revolution is still it either succeeds or it becomes part of the history of struggle that will embolden like a later effort to succeed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I'm kind of a Christian anarchist myself, and in the Christian anarchist tradition, there is a similar kind of eschatological expectation, this kind of deep faith or confidence that, you know, in the long run, it's like everything gets worse and worse, and the prospects for the church and the community of believers is expected to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And that's basically the apocalypse. Like it's in the apocalyptic times, it's sort of prefigured in the Christian theology that there's going to be less and less Christians. They're mostly all going to get, murdered, and it's going to be like really crazy and bad. But at the apex of it all, in the very final moment, at the end of time, basically, the few remaining believers will be the ones who ascend to the kingdom of heaven. And that kind of, it's a very similar structure to what you're saying, whether one's Christian or religious or not at all. There's a very similar kind of structure of belief and historical expectation in the Christian anarchist tradition. And, the anarchist wing of that is basically just like, you don't have to submit to any earthly power. You have to just basically, trust in the plan, trust in the process, and all will be, taken care of. So it's very fascinating because it's a very similar kind of mental model that a lot of these more atheistic and anarchistic wings are surprisingly aligned on a similar model, I think.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I think that also, like, I changed my mind about this. So you said just now that in the Christian imaginary, that process unfolds kind of automatically, or does it require like intervention in order to, like, on behalf of the believers to happen? Yeah,
that's a great question. I mean, there's lots of disputes, and there are different interpretations. Obviously, the concept of free will is important in kind of the most classical interpretations of like Christian theology, but there are lots of different spins on this, and there are actually quite a lot of sophisticated readings in the Christian tradition that actually are really quite close to a kind of almost like Landian accelerationist, like inhumanism, where like it's mostly process. So it's there. Nice. I think there's a lot of room for debate on this. I mean, I find Girard's reading of this very, very interesting. If you look at especially the late work of René Girard, he talks about how basically this is all like baked into Christian theology. Like Christianity, he says, is the only religion that predicts its own failure. That sees that it's doomed, and so long as on earth, like Christianity is always going to lose in a sense, and it's almost prefigured that will happen, and so I find that very kind of interesting. It's just it rhymes a little bit with what you're saying, where you're super cool with the idea that like DarkFi is going to get crushed once or twice or 3 times or 10 times, but it doesn't shake your fundamental conviction in its absolute inevitability.
Yes, yeah, for sure. But I guess where I became less Landian in a way was like this idea of it being inevitable and therefore not having to do anything. Whereas actually, you do need to be, in the thing that I'm describing now, I see it as like you do need to be active. You do need to kind of actively engage with this process in order for it to unfold. Like I don't see it as necessarily happening by itself.
Right.
So that's where a little bit when I kind of shifted from like a more Landian view into like this thinker Öcalan, it was this idea that you can actually change, you can actually influence the fate and like the direction of the future through like your revolutionary activity, basically.
And I'm sorry, I didn't quite ask. So Öcalan is like a Kurdish theorist, or tell the story a little more.
Yes, sure. So 1970s, there was a lot of Kurdish movements. I'll actually backtrack a bit. So, you know, Kurdish identity has existed for like millennia. It's an ancient language, one of the oldest ancient culture, an ethnic group. But they've been trapped between these four countries. Before it was two, it was the Ottomans and the other empire. Can't remember the name. And then now it's four countries since like in the past 100 years. And they've been, you know, repressed because, you know, basically part of the function of the state is like it has to deny things that contradictions that it can't integrate. So it's like, no, you can't be Kurdish, can't have Kurdish language. So in the 1970s, there was student movements in Turkey to establish Kurdish, more Kurdish autonomy and democratic recognition. And basically they were brutally crushed. A lot of the leaders were executed, others were imprisoned. And one of the prisoners basically decided while he was in prison that he couldn't use the democratic process and like protest in order to achieve autonomy. He had to basically assert it. So he left prison, he went to the mountains and he founded the guerrilla movement PKK.
Oh, okay.
And that's Abdullah Öcalan.
Okay.
So then, you know, decades pass, they continue to engage like a highly effective guerrilla war in the mountains and in Turkey. And basically in the about 20 years ago, Öcalan was arrested and brought to a prison island off of Turkey, one-man prison island, and he's been there for 20 years. And while he was there, he wrote these fascinating texts. And so it's like, there's a few of them. There's a 5-part manifesto, and there's 2 books which came prior to the manifesto. And these were all like smuggled out essentially as his defense to the European courts. So he was like, I have the opportunity to write a defense. I write a 5-part manifesto, like full on books, which he talks about like the history of civilization.
Wow.
And they're like super deep. And as a consequence of these books, the PKK had like a complete internal restructuring, like philosophical restructuring, because it had been more kind of traditional Marxist-Leninist, and also in the idea of like, we want a Kurdish nation state, essentially. You know, we want a nation. Same way that Ireland and most of the revolutions of the 20th century were about establishing independent nation states. So after, basically what Öcalan says is like, it's the nation state itself that's the problem. So we need to evolve like new political forms in order for people to be free. So like, even if Kurdish people were to have a nation state, they would still not be free. They would still be trapped like by the nation state paradigm. So like his books are all about describing, you know, how do we move beyond this, you know, and there is a lot of in a way, you know, these kind of undertones, like as you mentioned, this he comes across as a kind of prophet, like and it's interesting because the Middle East, you know, is this very spiritual place that has a long legacy of prophets, writing these like amazing texts, like these very futural texts. And when you read his books, you do get the sense of like, this is like coming backwards from the future. It has this like prophetic weight to it. And another interesting aspect is, if you've read the Leo Strauss on hidden writing, there's that book, Persecution and the Art of Writing, is the name of the essay. He's writing the books in a context where like a lot of the time he has a pen, but he has to like smuggle them out of a prison cell. So they've been viewed, you can imagine they've been viewed by all sides kind of thing. So there's a few consequences. One is that he doesn't have access to an editor. He's only allowed one book at a time. So, he's pretty limited when compared to normal kind of writers. and he's like, so he actually memorizes like huge amounts of texts from books so that he can write it. He's like memorizing so he can write. And all of these constraints I actually think make him a even more exceptional thinker. But so inside those texts, I believe that there are hidden messages.
Wow.
It's like there's one reading which is, you can read it as the European court, and you can see the texts of Öcalan as like a very kind of how to say, like a very nice kind of essay on the value of democracy, very pro-Western, pro-Enlightenment kind of vibe. But then there's like a subtext which is highly radical and revolutionary, and I also think there's other subtexts, like even more kind of encrypted, in which he's talking to like his comrades directly, because he doesn't have a line of contact, or he kind of does, but it would be a good opportunity to give some high level strategy.
Have these been published as books in English?
They're published in books in English.
Oh, cool.
Only the first 3 are translated of the manifesto. The prison writings have been translated, but the first 3 are already great. First one, Civilization, talks about the history of civilization coming back to the Neolithic until now. He talks about how the nation state emerges. The second one is called Capitalism, history of capitalism, again, like starting in Neolithic all the way to present day. Super interesting. And then 3, which I'm in process of reading, it's called The Sociology of Freedom. And that's where he gives his, like what I was talking about earlier, his really interesting definitions of what freedom is.
I see. And is he still alive?
Yeah, he's alive.
Yes.
He's alive. He's old
Does he like
now.
mess with crypto?
Oh, I wish.
No.
But, I mean, he's like,
I'm sure someone's asked him, like, what do you think about crypto?
Maybe.
How should we, instantiate privacy technology on crypto? Have you? No.
No, I don't think there's not much contact like with
Right.
it's not like even someone like Ross, like you can kind of you can write letters.
Yeah.
There's none of that.
Wow.
Yeah, he's like next level incarcerated.
He's on an island all by himself.
Yeah.
Damn.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are prison guards like with
Yes.
him, right?
Yeah, like around there'll be prison guards on the island for sure.
I mean, that's like pretty Chad to be put on an island by yourself. Like, you're so
Yes.
dangerous. They're so afraid of you.
Yes.
They're like not even going to put you on the same piece of land as other
Yes.
people.
Yeah, and you see this a lot when with like revolutionaries who are in prison, basically, that like they're seen as so dangerous because they have this like ability they have this like power of thought and of speech that they can actually change the behavior of the people around them. They can actually radicalize people just by
Right.
talking to them.
Like
So
like Napoleon after his downfall, like stuck him on an island.
yeah, that's what the state has to do. But it's very sad, and for the Kurdish people especially, it's like they have they're in constant pain from his incarceration. Especially like what's beautiful is in the third book, in the introduction, he says like he's standing against the kind of the individualism of that's like the West has made this like center of society. He's like I'm not Abdullah Öcalan who's like on trial. It's the Kurdish people themselves that like on trial like through me, which I thought was really beautiful.
So was going to see the Kurds and hang out with the Kurds and spend time with them and work with them, was that very transformative for you?
Yes, totally.
Seems like it. Yeah,
Yes,
I get that impression.
Yes. Yeah. It really put me on the straight and narrow. But I would love to go back. The people, it's like the people that you meet there, they've suffered a lot, but they have this incredible kind of like calm, almost like monk-like. They have this like inner light, which is like, yeah, they're like glowing with their like conviction.
Wow.
Yeah, it's really something to behold.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I think I only have one more question for you, which is,
Okay.
you're in town for Consensus
Yes.
conference, where I'll be speaking as well. And
Yes.
so I'm just curious, what is your talk going to be about?
Yeah, so some of the things that I discussed here, I'm going to be talking about actually guerrilla guerrilla warfare and encryption and the kind of connections between them. And so arguing basically that encryption as a kind of guerrilla warfare or guerrilla tactic. And then I'm also actually going to talk about Nietzsche. So I've been reading the book, Deleuze's book on Nietzsche. It's called Nietzsche and Philosophy.
Yeah.
Nietzsche and Philosophy.
I know it.
And he talks about creative and reactive forces, which I found really compelling, especially the idea that you have these active forces which are like affirming difference and they kind of tend toward differentiation, and then you have these reactive forces which are denying difference and which are like these kind of homogenies, and they have a way of integrating active forces and making them reactive. And then Nietzsche, he uses the eternal return to kind of rescue this this tragedy of this becoming reactive. So he's no, with the eternal return, it's that which is reactive basically dies, and you just have this proliferation of the active, which is becoming, and the being of becoming, the return, which Deleuze is really into. So I basically talk about that, and I connect it to basically this idea of anonymity and surveillance and guerrilla resistance and the state.
Fascinating. Cool.
Yeah.
I'll be there for that for sure. I'm
Good.
intrigued. Yeah. Well, I think we have to give some credit to CoinDesk, because it seems like they're trying pretty hard actually to move away from the saccharine, WAGMI ETH cults, if they're inviting people like you and me. So
yes, absolutely.
So my hat's off to them, and I'm quite intrigued actually, more so than I would be otherwise when I kind of notice that there's a lot of people like you and I there. So should be fun.
Totally.
Yeah, cool. So people can go check out DarkFi. Is the best place to send people. It's just dark.fi, right?
Dark.fi.
That's the URL.
Yeah, and we're in the process of updating our documentation and stuff, so I'm hoping we'll be a little bit less cryptic and a bit more accessible, because we actually want people to understand what we're building. We don't want to be obscure. Some people are going oh, I think they're intentionally being obscure. It's no, we're just a bit behind on documentation.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I love the website also, by the way. I like the aesthetic.
Nice.
Yeah,
we have a talented art director.
Yeah. And you've also written some interesting things in this regard, which I'll put links to
Cool.
your writings.
Yes.
About lunar, what is it?
Lunar punk.
That's right.
Yes.
You describe lunar punk in contrast to solar punk. Yeah, and it's very much along the lines, I think, of what we've been talking about.
Totally.
So I'll put some links to your writings in the show notes.
Thanks so much.
So people can check that out, and DarkFi as well. That's just dark.fi. All right, Rose, thanks so much. This was fun.
Thanks so much. Yeah,
this is great.
Thank
cool.
you.
That's a wrap.